Hi, everybody. This is Doc Martin. You're here on Maximum Medicine Radio. And with me by phone is Barbara Hand Clow, who most of you know. And Barbara, I'm so happy you're here. Thank you for calling in.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
So those of you who may need a reminder, if you're having any, we haven't connected with Barbara in a few years, but you will probably remember her from the Pleiadian agenda that she wrote, Catastrophobia. She worked with the Mayan code and working with the ideas of Carl Kalaman. And she is an astrologer, a teacher. She probably won't say this, but I think that she's a shaman. And she's a ceremonial teacher, having learned from her grandfather, who was a Cherokee, brought the Cherokee wisdom in. And today I want to talk about this idea that we are filled with fear of the end times, and how really, and Barbara's going to share with us, that's really not the truth, that we're kind of being a little bit duped by our own fears. So Barbara, tell us, basically, why are we so caught in this drama?
That's a good question.
Oh, and, sorry.
Yeah, and the information that I'm going to give is coming from Cherokee tradition and coming from teachings from my grandfather, which is where this whole thing first started for me. And that was written up in a book called Catastrophobia that you mentioned, which has now been retitled Awakening the Planetary Mind in a new edition. And basically what I learned from my grandfather, and then I spent about 35 years researching what he had to say as an adult and as a graduate student after that, to really verify and check out the stuff that he was saying. And basically what he said, and this is a legend that is in many, many traditions, which is that we went through a terrific cataclysm in our solar system and on this planet around 11,500 or 12,000 years ago. And you'll get that from Plato, you'll get that from a lot of alternative researchers. There's a lot of talk about what actually caused it, which we can get into. But the important thing about my work is that my grandfather wanted me to write about that issue from the point of view of what it's doing to human consciousness in our current now. In other words, who cares about what happened 12,000 years ago? What does it matter now? And at this point, we know from epigenetics, the study of memory that carries through generations and generations, we know at this point that people carry memories of ancient trauma and ancient cataclysms. And so what my grandfather basically did was he taught me a timeline from the cataclysm up to the current moment, which is my own research in my books. And basically he was saying, number one, the cataclysm was absolutely horrendous. And I, of course, described it in detail. And it isn't just the Earth, it's also the solar system, which I think is something to think about more and more in our current moment. But back to what my grandfather said for a moment, he also said to pay a lot of attention to the period after the cataclysm, which would be about 9,500 BC up to about 6,000 BC. We see signs of awakening and civilization emerging around 5,000 to 6,000 BC. But there's that dark period from about 9,500 BC to 6,000 BC. And what he was concerned about the most was that that was a period of survivalism. And that period of survivalism, in his opinion, was deeply imprinted in our minds. And so then when I became a researcher and a therapist and an astrologer, I kept on noticing how many people were basically stuck with some of those survival issues. And so at this point, with the kind of stress and fear that we're dealing with in the current time, I'm seeing many, many signs of people kind of reverting back to that survival level. You could almost call it tribal level of consciousness. And so people are responding very irrationally to what's happening at this moment. And first of all, the way it's playing out is extremely irrational. But it's important to start to identify within ourselves. And I have no doubt that listeners are doing this, because right now the astrology is showing us that the current moment, which is basically mostly like June of this summer up through December of this year, we are being affected by a series of astrological transits that are pushing us to the deepest level of survivalism and the deepest level of fear. And so, in my opinion, the more we identify the deep cause of this, I think the better we're going to be able to handle it. And also, I think most importantly, Sharon, I think one of the things I'd really like to concentrate on today is what can we do about it as individuals. First of all, for ourselves and our healing, and then for our communities and our families, because the larger level of it at this point is kind of like a gigantic flood or a gigantic explosion. You know, we're not able to get much awareness out of what's happening at the larger level. We're being driven deep inside now, and I actually think this is a very good thing, but it's very painful.
And especially when you talk about epigenetics, or we talk about genetic memories, if we're being triggered, and this is stuff that is triggering us at the very cellular biochemical level, that's hard at first to shake free of, because it feels, I mean, it's so inherent in our cellular matrix. We don't see it as outside.
Yeah, and what I'm noticing, of course, I keep watching people as much as observing, you know, and I'm noticing that the best cue for people, or the best key for people at this point, is what their body is doing. Because this is so intense that it's starting to activate various things that have been lurking and hidden in our bodies for probably thousands of years. And I'm finding if people can just keep hanging with their body, you know, and say to yourself, why is my left leg trying to tell me something? Whatever it is that people have going on. I'm finding that seems to be the direct access right now, because we're at this ultra kind of physical awakening level.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the conceptually what's inherent when many healers, especially energy healers and shamanic healers, keep saying, go be out in nature and be on the earth, because you're out of sensory stimulation of technology. And what basically you are breathing the air and you are putting one foot in front of the other. You're very body oriented at that time.
Yeah, and I agree. And another thing, as you know, I work a lot with the issue of 9 dimensions of consciousness. And nature is very 9-dimensional. All of the information and all of the cues are actually right there in nature. So between putting ourselves into deep contact with nature and then really going deep inside and observing like what we're feeling and what we're thinking and what's happening in our bodies, you could say that this spring, summer, fall is one of the probably the most intense levels of potential growth and access that we've ever seen. Certainly I've ever seen.
Well, you know, I was lamenting before I reflected on it using your perspective. I was lamenting because for I'd say about 2 months now, I have felt the most intense energy. And I thought, is it the polarization in this country? But it was more of a buildup of a surge of force. And when I was working on this outline and then talking with you, shifting it to see, and we'll get to more of this later in the show, to see that there is really, we can see the potential for something good to come out of it. But the way it feels at first is unbelievably intense.
Yeah, and then so much, the only way we're going to get through this passage, if you want to call that, and certainly astrology suggests that this year is a major passage, and the only way we're going to get through that is to start to get rid of the things that are in our way that that aren't effective for us anymore. So certainly the hardest part about this is having everything crashing all around us and just being destroyed and just disappearing. And yet, if and this is a good point to use the logical mind. How could it work any other way if we're basically evolving, as far as I can tell, to an entirely new level?
And I think we all would agree that there are many things in what we consider fixtures that we wouldn't mind if it was different. So it's just that when the tower is falling, it is very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the big transits this year was Pluto conjunct Saturn right around January 13th of 2020. And right at that point, that's when the first hinting about the COVID virus, or then back in those days, coronavirus came through. And then basically it took another month or two for things to actually start falling apart and crashing. And what happened at that point was a simultaneous drop and destruction of the oil market. There was a huge loss of money in the oil market, and obviously also a huge surge in artificial intelligence and virtual media. And so, on the one hand, I have a lot of concerns about what's going on with artificial intelligence and virtual media. But on the other hand, why are we bemoaning the end of the age of oil? In other words, what I'm suggesting is what's really going on here is the end of the age of oil and the age of artificial intelligence, which of course fits with Aquarius. We're moving rapidly now into the Aquarian field, and we always knew that that would be technological and that it probably would involve artificial intelligence. So that's a struggle to learn to adapt to that. But on the other hand, we have to let go of our dependence on fossil fuels. And I think that's a good example of the good things about this that are happening.
Well, I really like looking at the other perspective. And we're going to take a short break now. And when we come back, everybody, I'm here with Barbara Hand Clow, and we're going to keep talking about how we got triggered by this fear, but maybe what else is really going on. So we'll be back in a minute. Hi, everybody. I'm back. We're back with Barbara Hand Clow. And we were just talking at the break. I was reminding myself that she and her husband, Jerry, had worked with Bear Publishing, which subsequently is now connected, and she's going to tell me more later, with Inner Traditions. But anyway, that's a nice thing to remember, is her authorship and her books. But right now, what we're really talking about is we've got all of this fear and all of this memory of catastrophe, and we're being triggered as we really are in a major shift. And we could say an evolution of the planet, if not the galaxy, if not more than that. So Barbara, tell us more about what's going on.
Well, if you want to just look at it straight on, the human race is destroying the Earth. And unless the human race evolves to another level of consciousness and another level of respect with the Earth and integration of our psychology, our emotions, and karma, we're going to destroy this planet. And I don't see that happening. I never have seen that happening. And I've had many, many visions of many bad things, but I just don't see that happening. And so what seems to be going on during this period of time, especially mid-2019 through 2020, is we have an astrological setup that's functioning now that is, I went back thousands of years. We have major computers that allow us to go way, way back in time to check things. And nothing like this has happened for thousands of years, the way the planets are actually set up. And where that'll be useful to us later on the show is to look at what's actually going on right now and what we can do with it. But from a general point of view, we are definitely getting an evolutionary kick in the pants. And you can see it with the amount of polarization and stress between people. You can see it everywhere you turn on every level in society. But if you observe it fairly intellectually, you can actually detect the parts of it that are breaking down, such as I said before, the age of oil, because there are ways of living on this planet that are just not going to work anymore. And we are going to have, but the only thing that's going to change that is us. And so we are being forced to change individual by individual. And it's incredibly bizarre. I mean, for me, in the last week, I now just called Donald Trump the orangutan in the White House. I'm sorry, and I don't want to offend anybody who supports Donald Trump, because I support people who support Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is actually acting out an archetype. He's actually the carrier of a gigantic level of change in this lifetime, and I respect him for that. But right now, he's obviously sick. He's obviously not functional, and he's basically acting like an orangutan. Just have to say that.
He does.
We don't want to get.
He does prompt us in so many arenas. A bigger view might say that's an interesting position to hold in order to be the provocateur.
Yeah. And when I say he's the carrier of an archetype, I work with the issue of the great ages. Like the last great age was Aries, that ended in 100 BC. And now we're moving, then we went into the age of Pisces for 2,000 years. And now we're going into Aquarius. And so the character that played a role very similar to this during the last age change, back in 0 AD, is actually St. Paul. And St. Paul just infuriated a lot of people. And he was throwing old stuff out left and right and creating a new religion, basically. And so I think it's wise to think of figures who play this role as really being carriers of major archetypes. And then we can have more understanding of the way they're acting, the way they're behaving. And also we can have more respect for the processes that are in gear.
Right. And I just wanted to remind our listeners that the last segment on the show, you're going to go through the astrology with us. And that'll be really exciting for you to help us see that. So I want to just talk a little bit about what's unfortunate that I see is that we've got a very powerful media. We have a lot of technology, visual, audio, put together. I wanted to say contrived, but some of it's beautiful stuff that's built together in a visual stimulus in the media and in our use of social media, and that is really pushing a lot of fear. It's very triggering, and sometimes I worry that we've got that being used as control over the general population's way of thinking.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. But one of the things, as you know, I work with beings from the Pleiades called the Pleiadians. And the Pleiadians say that one of the really funny things about human beings is that all you have to do is turn it off. Or like when it comes to drugs, all you have to do is don't swallow them. So if you think about it, everything that we're taking in, we're doing it by choice. Like I'm not on Facebook and never was. And it would have been better for my career maybe if I was. I'm not doing any of that stuff simply because, not because I'm against it, but because it's not teaching me anything.
Right.
But there's a lot of people out there now who are learning to discriminate because they're starting to realize, like, hey, wait a minute, I thought I knew what I was thinking and I thought I knew what I was seeing, and I don't have any idea even who I am myself.
Right.
So that's part of when you transit from one great age into another. And the trilogy that you mentioned that I sent to you, I'm in the middle of fictional trilogy. And the fictional trilogy is dealing with this issue of what happens when these ages change. Because when we go out of an age and move into a new one, I'd say 95% of the people on the planet lose their bearings as to who they are. But what happens when you lose your bearings and you don't know who you are, anymore. You're either going to die or you're going to grow up, you know? And so we're in the middle of a huge waking up in that sense. And I'm especially fascinated with really young people, of course, because as you go down the generations, you can see a little bit more about the way this might turn out.
Right. And I think we all are very hopeful. And in the New Age community, we've heard a lot of talk about the indigos and the energetics of many of the young people that have been born since the 1980s. And it's very exciting. And they're not, many of them are not at all buying into any of the social mores or ways we do things. They are just not interested at all.
Yeah, it's true. And then there's an interesting issue to bring up, which would be called innocence, where you reach a point where what you've been taught and everything you've been told just doesn't make any sense to you anymore. And you just start to go into a completely clean slate. And that's where I find the whole struggle over child abuse really interesting. Now, my trilogy is devoted to sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and especially abuse of children. And the reason I'm after that topic is, first of all, because I think it's a really big deal right now, but also the loss of innocence. We're in a really big struggle right now over protecting that innocence and protecting those children. And all I can say about that is, if you look at it astrologically, these last few years have been really tough. I mean, it almost looks like everything is falling apart and everything is gone. But we're getting really close to a turning point now. And the astrology for the energies that is coming in next is much more reflective of a clean slate and a totally new way of looking at things. It's just that right now we're stuck in the middle of the building falling down, and it's very unpleasant.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back when we're going to get some of Barbara's ideas on how do we step outside of these fear-based interpretations. So we'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Hi, everybody. I'm Doc Martin. I'm here with Barbara Hand Clow, and we're talking about kind of the conspiracy of fear that's going around. And I wanted to remind everybody in the last segment, we're going to talk about what's going on from an astrological perspective, and that will help us understand it. And just to remind you that Barbara is an astrologer. Barbara, how did you first start learning that?
Well, when I was about 24 or 25, I was standing around with a group of people, and somebody brought their astrological chart in, and two astrologers were in the group who started looking at it and interpreting it for the person. And I got into it and said, well, look at this and look at that and look at how that works. And both the astrologers looked at me and said, how do you know that? And I'd never seen an astrological chart before. So that cued me into the fact that I had been an astrologer over and over again in past lives. It's an obvious one. Usually people's big talents actually come from things they've already done before. So at that point, I started studying astrology and doing early readings and all that. I ended up writing 2 astrology books. One of them is a book about Chiron, and the other one is called Astrology and the Rising of Kundalini. And both of those books, especially Astrology and the Rising of Kundalini, have done very well. And over the years, I've been mostly what's called a macro astrologer, which is what we're going to do today, which is looking at astrology from the point of view of how it affects all of us and not so much individual readings. I did individual readings for about 10 or 15 years, but my writing and teaching schedule just overwhelmed me and I had to stop. So I haven't done readings since 1991 in case people start trying to ask me if I can. I don't, because every reading takes me 5 hours. I take this whole thing very seriously because this is big karma. And so I've stuck with macro astrology. I've done a lot of lecturing of transits overall that are affecting all of us. And at this point, with what's going on this year especially, astrology is absolutely probably the very best tool that we have for getting beyond fear, because we can see why things are working out the way they are, and we also can see when some of the more difficult aspects of this are going to end, and when a new cycle is coming up here pretty soon now. It's going to change fairly radically at the end of this year and into 2021, which is good news. But meanwhile, we are in the karmic crunch right now. I mean, I wrote on a piece of paper today as I was thinking about talking to you that these last 4 months are basically a full grade psychoanalysis. This is like graduate school in consciousness. But of course, people are just overwhelmed. And if anybody out there is overwhelmed, don't feel like there's anything wrong with you, because the more we actually respond to what the astrology is saying, it's actually showing a higher sign of evolution. And we seem to be responding very intensely to the astrology. So do you want a little snapshot and then little few
yes,
talk
so
about
what
a few
I
planets?
just wanted to tell David, our producer, let's skip the third break and let's just go ahead and with the astrology and other things we can do to step beyond the fear and to also see that it's a bigger something and it's something good. So let's just use the time we have up until the top of the hour and just keep going.
Okay. So the first thing to master, which is a fairly easy concept, some of this is not going to be easy, but I usually do a pretty good job of making it easier at least. What's happening right now this year is we are having a series of transits that haven't occurred in 735 years. Wow. And so this takes us back to 1284 to 1285 AD, which is actually the really firm beginning of the development of Western civilization and ultimately into the industrial era. So the planets are showing us that we are going into a major transformation of things we've been created for 735 years. So the planets involved in this are Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. And Jupiter rules fortune and well-being, and Saturn rules structures and control and discipline. And then Pluto rules going to the deepest level of the truth, including even looking at the dark side. So these three planets have been together in the end of 2019 and into 2020. And they've also been pulling into that position for like 10 or 15 years. So most people will feel that what's going on now is kind of a culmination of stuff that's been developing since 2010, 2015. I think all of us kind of feel that. And the reason that these transits are so important is because these three planets are in Capricorn. And the sign Capricorn, first of all, rules Saturn. So one of the planets is in its ruling sign. And then secondly, Capricorn rules structure and form. And so what's happening is the transit of these three planets together in Capricorn are literally creating a complete and total reset of our reality. And that's why it's so profound, because people can feel that all of the basis of everything that they've based their life and community and experiencing on is transforming and shifting, and they don't know how to get a sense of like where they are. But because these planets are in Capricorn, these planets are pushing us to change ourselves in relationship to the changes that need to occur outside of us. And I think you've noticed some of these feelings, like Capricorn Capricorn is known as the goat that tries to go charging up the mountain. And Capricorn won't stop. Capricorn is relentless, and it's going to push you no matter what. And it doesn't care what you think, right? You can feel that.
And you know what's so funny, just a little aside, a month ago, I rescued two white pygmy goats. I've never had goats before in my life.
That's pretty good. Have you ever rescued a goat before?
I've never actually ever had a goat before, but anyway, I've been.
Well, no, that's pretty cute because it shows you're in tune, you know.
I've been reflecting, watching them. They they don't take orders from anyone. They are constantly leaping to the next thing. They are constantly on the move. And there is a bundle of joy in there, though, other than they headbutt each other all the time. But anyway, so tell us more. So Capricorn energy is going.
Yeah, you can't stop it. And so then what happens with these transits is what we look at is when do they come together? Because through a year and a half of this, they periodically conjunct each other. You can imagine that. They're in the sky together and they move back and forth and then they conjunct. So the first big conjunction in this complex was Saturn conjuncted Pluto, January 13th. And that's exactly when the report of COVID-19 came out of China. And that's exactly when the real mover and shaker of the change appeared. So as an astrologer, we can tell you, like we can say to you, when Saturn conjuncts Pluto, something really deep is going to happen that's going to drive us toward the truth, and it's going to drive us into restructuring our reality. We can say that, but we can't tell you what it'll be till it appears, because a whole lot of things could create that, if you follow what I mean.
Right.
But when we, so a bunch of us have been writing about this year for years, but we've been waiting anxiously to see what would actually happen, if you see what I mean. So this
in other words, you know that the energy of an event is predicted by planetary alignment. You just don't know what the event is.
Yeah, you just don't know what's going to create it. And in this case, of course, at this point, we know it's COVID-19. And then as we go through 2020, at this point, where are we? We're in early October. We watch to see what happens with different parts of this transit. And so when we see astrology being that accurate, which the astrology this year has been stunningly accurate, then we know that we are evolving. And even though this is painful and even though it's hard, knowing that there's a purpose to this, at least for me, that helps me a lot.
Yeah, because
you know what I mean?
I don't think we, even those of us who are considered New Age and light workers who reflect continuously about, am I evolving? Is my consciousness elevating?
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we never stop to think about that. So
yeah, and so I think it's very affirming, and like I'm one of those people who believes that I'm here at this point because I chose it, and I'm sure you are too. You know, and that also helps me, like deal with it. But seeing how this astrology works, then what I'd like to do is shift to what's going on right now, because we don't have a lot of time. And the question would be, once we understand what's going on right now with this, it's the same pattern. It's just that then what happens is other planets get into it. And that's when we see the real fruition of these patterns. And so what's happening right now is we're in the middle of a series of Mars transits. So first of all, I mentioned to you that Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto have been in Capricorn. So Mars has been in Aries, and Mars has been squaring those planets, which means Mars has had a 90-degree angle to those squares. And this is where the astrology of this year hasn't occurred for probably 10,000 years. This is really big stuff. It's like you could view the cosmos as an incredible movie at this time. So Mars has been retrograde in Aries. Yeah.
I was going to say, tell me, I mean, the only thing I know about Mars is he's the god of war, and Aries is a ram. So I get this very powerful masculine energy. Tell us, though, what is the energy of Mars being retrograde and squaring?
Right. Okay. So first of all, Mars rules using your power and taking force. It's a masculine force. You're absolutely right. Then when Mars is in Aries, which occurs every 2 years, then that development of that masculine force is doubled and tripled. It's much, much more powerful.
Wow.
Then because it's in aspect to these Capricorn planets, the goat, what's happening is that masculine force and that tendency to tear things up and to go charging forward is just incredibly potent during this period. And then the retrograde issue has to do with what's happening with Mars in the sky. And it's kind of too complex to explain that. It has to do with what things look like visually. So we don't have to go into that. But when it's in Aries, what happens is it pulls it into the deepest personal psychological level of development. So what I'm trying to say is that from September 9th to November 13th, we are definitely in the cosmic crunch. And it's pushing us to a level of breakdown and then breakthrough that's almost insane. And you can see it just with the orangutan in the White House. He's obviously just beside himself with what's happening. And it's actually the astrology, which is really fascinating for me, And so the question is, like, considering what I'm saying, what can we do about that? What can we do about that as individuals? And this is where dedication, every hour or every minute that you take in these next couple of months to get deeply into your inner truth and deeply into what you care about, that's the place where you're going to get the enlightenment. And because this force, as you put so very well, is masculine and very aggressive, what it does out in the world out there that's pushing our buttons like crazy is it creates bullying, it creates aggression, it creates conflict. And then what happens with all of that bullying and aggressiveness and conflict is it triggers us inside. And let's go back to the catastrophe, and let's go back to the issue of a cataclysm and the issue of survivalism. It's pushing us right now into the deepest levels of inner survival on this planet. And what's going to happen with that, the virus, of course, is the great teacher. Because notice what the virus is doing, even though all the public health people are trying to create a great big campaign. The virus is taking out a lot of older people who are ready to go. That's just what viruses always do. They always have, and they always will. And the way we're dealing with this is really crazy because we need to concentrate on protecting them, and we need to concentrate on not destroying the financial well-being of the people who still have to carry our culture on. So basically, if I was going to give a scorecard to the way the public health people are dealing with this, I'd give them about a D-.
Right.
And that's a real problem. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the virus is actually a teacher, and you can't fight a war with the virus.
Well, that's something that we've talked about before on the show, and you can see it when we're talking astrology and the movement of planets. There are forces in the galaxy, in the universe, that are so much bigger than us. We, as a little bitty human, cannot control it. And so,
it's really arrogance.
It really is. That's what some of us are pretty good at that. All of us are good at that some level. But how do we get to bringing out our creative? How do we get to our evolution, and even to leaving this aggressive male and balancing back into unity consciousness? How do we do that? Let's spend the last few minutes on that.
Yeah, and see, that's where the astrology is critical, because you aren't going to be able to do that right now.
Okay.
You can't, right? In other words, right now, this is the time to go in and go deep inside and do the difficult things. And what I see people doing is actually marvelous. People are gardening. People are drawing closer to their families. People are getting rid of things in their lives that aren't essential, and they're starting to concentrate on what really matters to them because they sense that. And what carries me through it is knowing that toward the end of the year, it's going to improve. Because as we get to the end of this year, especially the winter solstice in December, as we come up to that point, we start to get a movement out of Capricorn and into Aquarius. And so on December 21st, 2020, at the winter solstice, right at the time of the solstice, Jupiter and Saturn conjunct in 0 degrees Aquarius. And what's going to happen with that is all of a sudden we're going to look around ourselves and we're going to start to see positive things happening that are way into the future. And I'm already seeing some signs of that, but not much, because this crunch of getting people to change is the central focus at this time. And it would appear to me that our president of the United States can be depended upon to keep driving people into chaos and terror, because that's what he's doing. That's the archetype that he's carrying. You know,
Right.
he's carrying the archetype of the wounded male.
And, you know, I'll just share that I am often in a daily argument's too strong a word with my brother, with my push to constantly pull him out of his lamenting about the details of politics and pulling him back to tell me about your pets, because he always has good pet stories. Tell me about something good. In other words, go inward and find, like the gardening, like learning how to cook family dinners together because we're now quarantined at home. Go to and hold on to that good part of our inner self and amplify it.
And you might want to even encourage him to look at how he feels inside when these things are going on, whatever it is that's bugging him. Because, see, that's where the teaching is. The archetype is being carried very visibly right now and very painfully. And it's something that we can learn from. It's happening for a reason. You know what I mean? And then meanwhile, people are doing family dinners and they are cooking and they are creating a deeper reality. So people are actually really doing pretty much the right things. But what I'd hate to see people do is to miss the opportunity to go into the deepest truth. And the only way you can do that is to watch out for what triggers you. And if something makes you really mad, and if something makes you feel like you're going to die, or if something makes you feel like it's really evil or whatever, look inside yourself for that, because that's where the change is going to come from, you know?
Yeah, that's hard work.
Yeah, it is hard work.
You have to
and what's ironic about it is so many of our healers right now basically are having trouble working. It's like a lot of the healing trades have been kind of shut down by this, just when people need the healers the most, you know. But people are healing anyway, regardless of that.
So come the solstice, then what can we look forward to, say in the beginning of 2021?
Well, right at the time of the solstice, we should see this new energy coming in. And then as we get into January, some other good transits are happening, like Mars is finally out of Aries and it goes into Taurus, and that's going to help luck because that's going to settle it down. So in the winter in 2021, we should start to see kind of like, you know, those new sprouts in the spring when the new things are coming up. If we look closely, I think we're going to see new things coming forth. But most importantly, I think it's going to calm down, and I think we're going to have more reason coming in. Finally, the election situation will be solved, and there will be a sense of direction in the United States. And that's a big deal because the United States affects the whole world to such an extent. And we will get through it. Like the astrology totally predicts this election to be exactly the way it is. But it's going to end. You know, this too shall pass.
So if we can spend the last few minutes recapping, paying attention to our feelings, so the things that trigger us, and going down inside to really assess within ourselves. Can you speak more to the things that we as individuals can do to help minimize the polarization, to use the most of this evolutionary crunch, this cosmic crunch, to help us evolve, to get us over the hump?
Yeah, it's a good question because there's another interesting series of transits, which I'm not going to, it's too much detail, you know what I mean? But this other series of transits is showing that the real core way to solve the conflict is between men and women. And that doesn't mean, that doesn't rule out two men or two women. That's just an issue of male-female. because there's two asteroids that are affecting this phase of time. And it has to do with healing the wounded masculine, which you spotted right away with Mars. And then another one has to do with activating the power of women. So we've got these two wonderful, very powerful transits showing the activation of female empowerment as the wounded masculine is healing itself. So a tremendous amount of this work is going to be done at the masculine feminine level between people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what else can an individual do? For me, as we talked a little bit before, I absolutely am compelled to be in nature with my animals. I gave up, of course, Corona added to that, but I gave up the gym in order to walk outside. What else can people do?
Well, there's the usual healing practices, but this particular yoga and different healing sessions and all that. I mean, life between lives and regression, all those things are there and they're all good for us. But I think that the main issue is a dedication to looking within as a response to what's happening out there. Because this is quite a show that's been created. I mean, we're getting massive entertainment just as all of our entertainment systems are getting shut down.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's so triggering that we take it as gospel and we take it personally. And I'm just so glad we're talking about this, because you're helping us see that there's a bigger flow of energy and planetary structure that's guiding us, and that we don't have to pay attention to the consensus reality, that it's really something bigger. So I'm very grateful to you for showing us that today.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I would just say that the thing that's really breaking down is what I call the war mentality. And so everybody has to have a war, and you can't have a war with the virus. And so another big teaching that's going to come in here is the awareness that the only way you can deal with the virus is be healthy yourself. And see, this is the same as the emotional issue. If you're emotionally healthy, you can handle this.
Right.
If you see what I mean. So much of this virus is an incredible teacher. And you can't sanitize the whole planet and kill off the viruses and microbes. The viruses and microbes are from the second dimension. There are second dimensional teachers. And they're going to be here long alive. Yeah. The viruses are there to either take us out because we're ready to go, or get our immune system to kick into a higher gear.
I understand that. I agree with that. So we just have 1 or 2 minutes left. I want to remind everybody, Barbara Hand Clow, everybody, she's writing a new trilogy, the revelations of the ruby crystal, the revelations of Aquarius. And what's the third, age. Barbara?
Revelations from the source. Revelations from the source. And it'll be out in 2021 sometime.
Wonderful. So,
and this track, the trilogy, okay, good.
Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say the trilogy tracks 2011 through 2020, the very period of time that we're talking about today.
Awesome. That'll be really wonderful. So everybody, thank you for listening. Barbara's here to remind us that we're part of something bigger, and we've got to do our inner work, which we always know, but sometimes we avoid. And Barbara, thank you a million for joining us. And we're so happy to have you back and teaching us again, and love to see, of course, for me, I'd love to see more of you. So thank you so much.
You will. I'm coming back out. It was hard to write this. It was very, very difficult. But thank you for having me, Sharon, because I really just appreciate the chance to talk to you.
Very excellent. Thank you. And everybody, this is Doc Martin, Maximum Medicine Radio, and you've been listening to Barbara Hand Clow. And thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Okay, bye.